Sometimes the most crushing weight isn't poverty or hunger, but watching your dreams die one student at a time. For Emma Hartwell, standing in the freezing Cedar Falls schoolhouse with only 3 children left in her class, that nightmare had become her daily reality. The torn primer in her hands told a story no teacher should have to live. 6 months since the mine layoffs began, and parents had been pulling their children out of school one by one. Now she faced an empty classroom and a school board meeting that would surely end her career. That's when she heard heavy boots on the wooden steps and a voice that would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Through the frost-covered windows, she saw Jacob Stone, the mysterious mountain man who owned half the ridge, standing in her doorway like he'd stepped out of the wilderness itself. He looked right at her with those piercing gray eyes and spoke words that made her heart skip. "Work my land and I'll work to deserve you." Most folks in Cedar Falls knew Jake as solitary and untouchable, a man who kept to his mountain ranch and spoke to no one. But what happens when the loneliest man in the mountains finds the most determined woman in the valley? Emma's breath came out in small white puffs as she stared at Jake Stone through the schoolhouse doorway. The man filled the frame completely, his broad shoulders covered by a heavy wool coat that had seen better decades, and his dark hair touched with early silver despite his relatively young age. But it was his eyes that made her pulse quicken, not with fear but with something she couldn't quite name. They weren't the harsh, judging eyes she'd expected from the stories the townspeople told. They held something deeper, a quiet intensity that suggested he saw far more than most people gave him credit for. "Mr. Stone," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I wasn't expecting anyone today." The children, Billy, Grace, and Thomas, had pressed themselves against the far wall, their young eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear. At 8, 6, and 10 respectively, they represented the last of her students, the ones whose parents couldn't afford to send them away to relatives in larger towns or simply couldn't bear to see their children's education end. Jake's gaze swept the nearly empty classroom, taking in the patched windows, the worn wooden benches, and the pile of outdated textbooks that Emma had been trying to stretch into a proper curriculum. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he absorbed the evidence of the school's dire circumstances. "Heard the school board's meeting tonight," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard the first time he spoke. "Heard they're planning to close this place down." Emma felt her chest tighten at the blunt assessment. "The mining company layoffs have been difficult for everyone," she replied carefully, unwilling to reveal just how desperate her situation had become. "Families have had to make hard choices. Including you," he observed, and something in his tone suggested he knew more about her circumstances than she'd realized. The truth was that Emma hadn't been paid in 2 months. Mrs. Finnegan, her elderly landlady, had been patient about the rent, but that patience was wearing thin. The small savings she'd brought from back east had long since been exhausted on school supplies she'd purchased with her own money, trying to give her remaining students the education they deserved. Jake stepped further into the room, and Emma could see the children's fascination growing. Thomas, the oldest and most outspoken, had straightened up with the curiosity that had made him one of her best students. "Are you really the mountain man?" the boy asked with 10-year-old directness. "The one who has the biggest ranch in the whole territory?" A smile touched the corner of Jake's mouth, the first softening of his stern expression since he'd arrived. "I suppose I am, son, though I prefer to think of myself as a rancher who happens to live on a mountain." He looked back at Emma, his expression growing serious again. "Miss Hartwell, I came here with a proposition." Emma's heart began to race, though she couldn't say whether it was from hope or alarm. Propositions from men like Jake Stone could mean many things, not all of them respectable. But there was something in his manner that suggested whatever he had in mind was serious and carefully considered. "What kind of proposition?" "The kind that could solve both our problems," he replied. "I've got a ranch that's been running itself into the ground since my wife died 3 years ago. Good land, good water, plenty of room for cattle and crops both, but I've been managing it alone, and a man can only do so much." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. "I need someone with education, someone who understands planning and organization, someone who can help me turn it into what it could be." Emma felt her breath catch. The offer was so unexpected, so far from anything she'd imagined, that she struggled to process it. "You're offering me work on your ranch?" The question came out more sharply than she'd intended, but the whole situation felt surreal. "I'm offering you partnership," Jake corrected, and the distinction was important. "Not as hired help, but as someone with equal say in how the place is run. You bring your education and your planning skills. I provide the land and the resources. We build something together." He glanced at the children, who were hanging on every word. And these young ones, they'd have a proper place to learn, with books and supplies and everything else they need. The offer was so generous, it was almost frightening. Emma had learned to be suspicious of charity, especially from men with resources and unclear motivations. "Mr. Stone, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure I understand what you're truly asking of me." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the frost-covered windows that looked out toward the mountains where his ranch lay hidden among the pines. When he spoke again, his voice was rougher, more vulnerable than it had been. 3 years ago, I lost everything that mattered to me. My wife Catherine died in childbirth, along with our son. Since then, I've been existing, not living. The ranch has potential, but I've let it slide because I couldn't see the point in building something alone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He turned back to her, and Emma saw pain in his eyes that matched her own recent losses, though of a different kind. "You're facing the end of everything you've worked for, everything you believe in. These children are losing their chance at education because of circumstances beyond anyone's control. Maybe we can help each other find a different path forward." Emma looked at Billy, Grace, and Thomas, saw the hope beginning to kindle in their young faces, and felt something shift inside her chest. The practical part of her mind was already working, seeing possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to imagine. A ranch with resources, space for a proper school, the chance to create something lasting rather than simply fighting to preserve what was already failing. "What exactly would this partnership entail?" she asked carefully. "I have no experience with ranching, and I assume you have little experience with formal education. We'd learn from each other." Jake replied simply. "I know cattle and land management, crop rotation, weather patterns, how to make the most of what nature provides. You know books and planning, how to organize information, how to teach and motivate people to learn. Between us, we could create something neither of us could manage alone." Thomas raised his hand, with the automatic gesture of a student seeking permission to speak. "Would we really get to live on a mountain ranch?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. "With horses and cattle and everything? If your parents agree, and if Miss Hartwell decides to accept the partnership," Jake confirmed. "There's a building on the property that could be converted into a proper schoolhouse, with real glass windows and a stone fireplace for warmth. Room for a dozen students if more families want to send their children." Emma felt tears prick her eyes at the picture he painted. After months of struggling with inadequate supplies and watching her dreams crumble, the vision of a real school with proper resources seemed almost too good to be true. "And what would you gain from this arrangement? Mr. Stone, surely you could hire any number of people to help manage your ranch." Jake was quiet for so long that Emma wondered if she'd somehow offended him. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Purpose," he said simply. "For 3 years, I've been going through the motions of living without any real reason to get up in the morning. Watching you fight so hard for these children's future, seeing how much their education means to you. It reminds me that there are things worth building, worth working toward." The honesty of his admission left Emma speechless. She'd expected many things from this conversation, but not such raw vulnerability from a man with Jake Stone's reputation for solitude and self-sufficiency. The mountain man the townspeople described was supposed to be cold and unreachable, not someone capable of recognizing and responding to another person's calling. "I would need to speak with the children's parents," she said slowly, her mind already working through the practical considerations. "And I would need to understand exactly what living arrangements you're proposing. I won't compromise my reputation or put myself in a position that could be misunderstood. Of course, Jake agreed immediately. The ranch house is large enough for separate quarters with complete privacy. Mrs. Martinez, my housekeeper, has been with the family since before my marriage, and she would serve as proper chaperone for any arrangements. Everything would be conducted with absolute propriety. Emma studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden agenda, but found only sincere determination. The offer seemed genuine, born of mutual need rather than charity or ulterior motives. Still, the magnitude of the decision felt overwhelming. How long would you give me to consider your proposition? The school board meets tonight, Jake replied. After that meeting, your options in Cedar Falls will be limited. But if you're willing to trust me with one afternoon, I'd like to show you the ranch, let you see what we'd be working with. Then you can make your decision with all the information. Emma looked around the classroom that had been her world for the past year, at the children who represented everything she'd fought to preserve, at the evidence of a dream that was dying despite her best efforts. Then she looked back at Jake Stone, this unexpected man who'd appeared with an offer that seemed too good to be true, yet felt somehow inevitable. Mr. Stone, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, I accept your invitation to see the ranch. But I want you to understand something. If I agree to this partnership, it will be because I believe we can create something meaningful together, not because I have no other choice. I won't be anyone's charity case or consolation prize. Jake's face broke into the first genuine smile she'd seen from him, transforming his stern features completely. Miss Hartwell, he said with obvious respect, I wouldn't have it any other way. A partnership requires equals, and I have the feeling you're more than equal to anything this mountain can throw at us. As if summoned by the changed atmosphere in the room, Max Sullivan appeared in the doorway, his weathered face creased with curiosity as he took in the scene. Jake's ranch hand and closest friend had clearly been waiting outside, probably wondering what had possessed his employer to visit the schoolhouse in the middle of a weekday. Mac, Jake said without turning around, I'd like you to meet Miss Emma Hartwell. She's considering joining us at Stone Ridge to help turn the place into what it should be. The introduction carried weight beyond the simple words, and Mac's expression shifted from curiosity to careful assessment. Ma'am, Mac said with respectful politeness, touching his hat brim. Pleasure to make your acquaintance. Jake's been talking about needing help with the planning side of things for months now. His gaze moved to the children, who were still pressed against the wall but no longer seemed frightened. These the young ones who'd be coming along. That remains to be decided, Emma replied diplomatically. But yes, Billy, Grace and Thomas represent my current students. She turned to address the children directly. We're going to visit Mr. Stone's ranch this afternoon to see what opportunities might exist there. I want you to go home and tell your parents exactly what's been discussed here today. No secrets, no promises that haven't been made. Can you do that for me? The three nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of the situation even if they couldn't fully comprehend all its implications. Thomas raised his hand again. Miss Hartwell, does this mean we won't have to stop going to school? Emma felt her heart clench at the hope in his voice. The same hope she was trying so hard not to let herself feel. I don't know yet, Thomas, but we're going to explore every possibility. I promise you that. As the children gathered their few belongings and prepared to leave, Emma found herself alone with Jake and Mac. The schoolhouse felt different now, charged with possibility rather than weighed down by failure. Through the windows, she could see the mountains rising toward the sky, no longer seeming like barriers but like promises of something greater. Ready to see what we might build together? Jake asked, extending his arm with old-fashioned courtesy. Emma took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and made the choice that would change everything. Yes, Mr. Stone, I believe I am. The wagon ride up the mountain trail was unlike anything Emma had ever experienced. The path wound through stands of towering pines that seemed to touch the very clouds, their branches heavy with snow that sparkled like diamonds in the afternoon sun. Mac drove the sturdy team of horses with practiced ease, while Jake sat beside Emma on the bench seat, pointing out landmarks and explaining the layout of his property with the quiet pride of a man who truly loved his land. "That ridge there marks the eastern boundary," he said, gesturing toward a rocky outcropping that jutted from the mountainside like the backbone of some sleeping giant. Clearwater Creek runs along the bottom of the valley, providing water year-round even in the driest summers. The main house sits in a natural clearing about 2 miles ahead, sheltered from the worst winds but positioned to catch the morning sun. Emma listened carefully, trying to absorb not just the geographical information but the deeper meaning behind Jake's words. This wasn't just land to him. It was home, legacy, the foundation of everything he'd tried to build with his late wife. The fact that he was willing to share it with a virtual stranger spoke to either desperation or genuine recognition of potential partnership. She suspected it was more the latter than the former. "How long have you owned the property?" she asked, genuinely curious about the history of the place that might become her new home. "My father homesteaded the original claim 25 years ago," Jake replied, his voice carrying the weight of family history. "Started with just 160 acres and a determination to prove that this mountain could support more than just trappers and prospectors. He spent 15 years building it into something substantial before the fever took him and my mother within a week of each other." The tragedy in that simple statement wasn't lost on Emma. She'd lost her own parents to typhoid when she was barely 18, forcing her to make her own way in the world through teaching, one of the few respectable professions available to an educated woman without family connections. "That must have been incredibly difficult," she said softly, recognizing the pain of sudden orphanhood even years after the fact. "It was," Jake acknowledged without self-pity. "But Catherine helped me through it. We married the following spring, and for 8 years we worked together to expand what my father had started. We added the main pastures, built the new barn, established relationships with buyers in Denver and Colorado Springs." She had a head for the business side of things that complemented my knowledge of the land itself. Emma noticed the way his voice softened when he spoke of his late wife, and she felt a complicated mix of sympathy and something else she didn't want to examine too closely. It was clear that Catherine Stone had been deeply loved, and equally clear that her loss had left Jake adrift in ways that went far beyond simple grief. The question was whether he was ready to move forward or simply looking for someone to help him maintain what she'd left behind. "What happened after she died?" Emma asked gently, sensing that understanding this part of his story was crucial to understanding what he was truly offering her. Jake was quiet for so long that Emma began to think she'd overstepped, pushed into territory too personal for their brief acquaintance. But finally, he spoke, his words coming slowly, as if each one required careful consideration. "I gave up," he said simply. "Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually. I stopped making plans for improvements, stopped thinking about expansion, stopped believing that the future held anything worth working toward." Mac kept the day-to-day operations running, but the vision, the drive to build something greater, that died with Catherine. The honest admission hung in the mountain air between them, raw and vulnerable in a way that suggested Jake Stone rarely revealed such depths to anyone. Emma found herself deeply moved by his willingness to share not just his loss but his failure to overcome it. The very human admission that grief had defeated his ambitions even as he continued to function. "And now?" she asked quietly, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Now I think maybe it's time to remember that building something worthwhile doesn't require the same person who helped you envision it originally." Jake replied, his gray eyes meeting hers with startling intensity. "Maybe it just requires someone who shares the commitment to excellence and the belief that effort directed toward meaningful goals is never wasted." Before Emma could respond to this implicit invitation to see herself as that someone, The wagon crested a ridge and revealed the Stone Ridge Ranch spread out below them like something from a painting. The main house was a substantial two-story structure built from local stone and timber, its design both practical and elegant in the way of buildings constructed by people who understood their environment. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, suggesting warmth and comfort within, while the surrounding buildings spoke of a working ranch that had been planned rather than simply accumulated over time. Sweet heavens, Emma breathed, unconsciously echoing the children's earlier wonder. The scope of the property was far beyond anything she'd imagined. Pastures stretched toward distant ridges, marked by split-rail fences that followed the natural contours of the land. A large barn dominated the working area, its red paint still vibrant against the snow, while several smaller outbuildings suggested specialized functions for different aspects of ranch operations. The building there, the one with the large windows facing south, Jake said, pointing to a structure that sat slightly apart from the main cluster of buildings. That's what I was thinking could be converted into a schoolhouse. It was originally designed as Catherine's music room, but it's never been properly finished or used for anything. Emma studied the building with growing excitement. The windows Jake had mentioned would provide excellent natural light for reading and writing, while the southern exposure would help with heating during the winter months. The size appeared more than adequate for a dozen students, with room for proper desks, bookshelves, and all the educational materials she dreamed of having in Cedar Falls. "It's perfect," she said, then caught herself. "I mean, it appears to have excellent potential for educational purposes." Jake smiled at her attempt to maintain professional objectivity, even as her enthusiasm showed clearly in her voice and expression. "Feel free to be excited about it," he said kindly. "If we're going to be partners, I want you to be genuinely interested in what we're building together, not just politely accommodating my suggestions." As they drew closer to the main house, Emma could see more details that spoke to the property's quality and potential. The fences were well maintained. The buildings showed evidence of careful upkeep despite Jake's claims of letting things slide. And everything had the solid, permanent look of improvements made with long-term thinking, rather than quick expedients. "How many cattle do you currently run?" she asked, her teacher's mind automatically seeking to understand the scope and scale of the operation she was being invited to help manage. "About 200 head at present," Mac answered from the driver's seat, speaking for the first time since they'd left town. "Could easily support 400 or 500 with proper pasture management and winter feeding programs. Jake's got some of the best grazing land in the territory. But we've been running conservative numbers since Catherine passed." "Conservative meaning profitable but not ambitious," Jake clarified. "We've focused on maintaining what we had rather than growing or improving. It's a sustainable approach, but it doesn't begin to realize the property's potential." Emma nodded, beginning to see the scope of what Jake was proposing. This wasn't just about providing her with employment or the children with educational opportunities. He was talking about a genuine expansion of the ranch's operations, with her organizational and planning skills playing a crucial role in that growth. The magnitude of the responsibility was both thrilling and intimidating. "What specific role do you see me playing in this expansion?" she asked, as the wagon pulled up before the main house. "I want to make sure we both understand exactly what we're discussing." Jake climbed down from the wagon and extended his hand to help Emma descend, a gesture of courtesy that seemed natural rather than calculated. "I see you handling the administrative side of the operation," he said, as they walked toward the house. "Record keeping, correspondence with buyers, planning for seasonal requirements, coordinating with suppliers. The kinds of tasks that require education and attention to detail, things I've been handling poorly or ignoring entirely." He paused at the front door, his hand on the latch as he turned to face her directly. "But more than that, I see you bringing perspective I've lost. The ability to look at what we have, and envision what it could become, to plan systematically for improvement rather than just responding to immediate needs. Catherine had that kind of vision, and without it, I've been treading water instead of swimming toward shore. The front door opened before Jake could lift the latch, revealing a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair, pulled back in a practical bun. This had to be Mrs. Martinez, the housekeeper Jake had mentioned, and her appearance immediately put Emma at ease. There was nothing calculating or suspicious in the older woman's expression, just genuine curiosity and welcome. "Rosa," Jake said with obvious affection, "I'd like you to meet Miss Emma Hartwell. She's considering joining us here at Stone Ridge to help improve our operations and establish a proper school for the Valley children." "Miss Hartwell," Rosa Martinez said with a slight accent that suggested Spanish heritage, "welcome to Stone Ridge Ranch. Please come inside out of the cold. I have coffee warming and fresh bread from this morning's baking." The interior of the house was even more impressive than Emma had expected. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace that provided both warmth and a focal point for furniture that managed to be both comfortable and elegant. Books lined built-in shelves along one wall, while windows provided views of the surrounding mountains that were nothing short of spectacular. Everything spoke of thoughtful planning and quality construction, the kind of home built by people who intended to stay and wanted their children to inherit something worthwhile. "This is beautiful," Emma said honestly, running her hand along the smooth wood of a dining table that could easily seat 12 people. "Your wife had excellent taste." "She did," Jake agreed without the sharp pain that had marked earlier references to Catherine. "But she also had practical sense. Every room in this house serves a purpose, and everything was chosen to last rather than simply to impress." She understood that true elegance comes from functionality, perfected rather than ornamentation added. Rosa appeared with a tray bearing coffee cups and thick slices of bread that smelled of honey and herbs. "Miss Hartwell," she said, as she set the tray on the table, "Jake has told me about your work with the children in town. It must be very difficult to see their education threatened by circumstances beyond their control." "It is," Emma admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. The warmth felt wonderful after the cold wagon ride, and the bread was better than anything she'd tasted in months. "These children have such potential, such eagerness to learn, but without proper resources and stability, that potential will be wasted. It's heartbreaking to watch." "Then perhaps this partnership Jake proposes will serve everyone's interests," Rosa observed with the wisdom of someone who had seen many changes and adaptations over the years. "The house has been too quiet since Catherine died, and Jake has been too alone with his grief and his responsibilities. New energy, new purpose, these things could benefit everyone involved." Emma studied Rosa's face, looking for any sign that the housekeeper was merely being polite or supportive of her employer's wishes. Instead, she saw genuine conviction and what appeared to be relief at the possibility of positive change in the household's dynamics. If Rosa Martinez truly believed this partnership could work, that carried significant weight in Emma's assessment of the situation. "Mrs. Martinez," Emma said carefully, "if I were to accept Mr. Stone's proposal, what would be your honest assessment of the challenges I might face? I'd rather know the difficulty up front than discover them through unpleasant experience." Rosa smiled approvingly at the direct question, clearly appreciating Emma's practical approach to the situation. "The isolation can be difficult," she said honestly. "We are 20 miles from town over mountain roads that can be impassable during winter storms. For someone accustomed to the social opportunity, the solitude might feel overwhelming at times." She paused to sip her coffee, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "Jake is a good man, but he has become set in his ways of solitude. He will need time to adjust to having someone share in the planning and decision-making he has handled alone for 3 years. And the work itself is demanding. requiring attention to details that city-educated people sometimes find tedious or overwhelming. Emma appreciated the honest assessment, particularly Rose's willingness to acknowledge potential areas of conflict rather than simply promoting the benefits of the arrangement. What about the children? How would they adapt to ranch life after town schooling? Children adapt more easily than adults, Rosa replied with the confidence of someone who had raised several of her own. They would have animals to care for, space to explore safely, practical skills to learn alongside their book education. For young ones, with energy and curiosity, ranch life offers opportunities that classroom walls cannot provide. Jake had been listening to this exchange without interruption, but now he leaned forward with obvious interest. Rosa raises important points about the challenges, he said seriously. I want you to understand that this partnership wouldn't be easy, even if it proves successful. Ranch life requires commitment and flexibility that teaching in town does not demand. He stood and moved to the window that looked out over the main yard, his gaze distant as he continued. But I also want you to understand what we could accomplish together if we're both willing to invest ourselves fully in the effort. This property could support not just a larger cattle operation but also crop production, perhaps even a small dairy operation. The school could serve families throughout the valley, providing education opportunities that currently don't exist. Emma joined him at the window, following his gaze across the snow-covered landscape that stretched toward distant peaks. She could envision children playing in the yard while their parents worked the land, families gathering for community events in the large main room. The satisfaction of building something lasting and meaningful in this beautiful but demanding environment. Mr. Stone, she said slowly, her decision crystallizing as she spoke, I believe your proposal has merit. But I want to suggest some modifications to ensure we both understand exactly what we're committing to. Jake turned to face her, his expression alert and interested rather than defensive. What modifications did you have in mind? First, I want this to be a genuine partnership with shared decision-making rather than employment with expanded responsibilities. Emma said firmly, if my organizational skills and educational background are valuable enough to warrant this offer, then my opinions on ranch operations should carry corresponding weight. Agreed, Jake said immediately. What else? Second, I want the school to be established as a separate entity from the ranch, with its own budget and policies. Emma continued, the children's education should never be compromised by business considerations or personal conflicts that might arise between us. Jake nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. The school's mission should be protected regardless of how our partnership develops. What's your third point? Emma took a deep breath, knowing this next requirement might be the most difficult for Jake to accept. Third, I want a clear understanding about living arrangements and social expectations. I'm willing to relocate here and commit to this partnership, but I won't accept any arrangement that compromises my independence or creates assumptions about personal relationships that haven't been explicitly discussed and agreed upon. The room fell silent as Jake considered this requirement. Emma could see him weighing the implications of what she was asking, understanding that she was drawing clear boundaries between their professional partnership and any potential personal connection. Finally, he spoke with the same careful consideration that had marked their entire conversation. Miss Hartwell, he said formally, I want to assure you that my proposal is based entirely on professional considerations and mutual benefit. While I find you to be an intelligent and admirable woman, I'm not assuming or requesting anything beyond a working partnership. Your independence and reputation will be completely respected and protected. The sincerity in his voice convinced Emma that he meant exactly what he said, though she noticed a flicker of something else in his expression that suggested the topic of personal relationships might not remain closed indefinitely. For now, though, his assurance was exactly what she needed to hear. Then I believe we have the foundation for an agreement, Emma said, extending her hand in the same businesslike manner she might use to close any professional arrangement. When would you want this partnership to begin? Jake shook her hand firmly, his grip warm and strong and somehow reassuring in its steadiness. As soon as possible, he replied. The school board meeting is tonight, and after that your position in Cedar Falls will likely be eliminated regardless. If you're willing, we could begin immediately with planning the school conversion and organizing the administrative systems for spring expansion of the ranch operations. Emma felt a flutter of excitement mixed with apprehension as the reality of her decision settled in. She was about to leave everything familiar and comfortable to embark on an adventure that would challenge every assumption she'd made about her life and future. But looking around the warm, welcoming room and seeing the genuine respect in Jake Stone's eyes, she felt more hopeful than she had in months. "Very well, Mr. Stone," she said with a smile that reflected her growing confidence in this unexpected path. "Let's build something extraordinary together." The children's parents reacted to Emma's announcement with a mixture of disbelief, hope, and careful suspicion that reflected the practical wisdom of people who had learned not to trust offers that seemed too good to be true. Emma had requested meetings with each family individually, wanting to ensure that every parent fully understood what she was proposing and had the opportunity to ask questions without the influence of community pressure or gossip. The first meeting was with Henry and Margaret Lawson, Billy's parents, in their small cabin on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. Henry worked sporadically at the mine when shifts were available, while Margaret took in washing to supplement their meager income. Their home was clean but sparse, with furniture that had been mended multiple times and windows covered with oiled paper rather than glass. "Miss Hartwell," Henry began slowly, his weathered hands clasped tightly together. "We appreciate everything you've done for Billy's schooling, but this offer from Jake Stone, it sounds like something out of a fairy tale. Rich men don't just invite poor families to share their good fortune without expecting something in return." Emma had expected this skepticism and had prepared her response carefully. "Mr. Lawson, I understand your concerns completely. But this isn't charity, and it isn't too good to be true. Mr. Stone needs genuine help with his ranch operations. Help that requires education and organizational skills. In exchange, he's offering me a true partnership in expanding the business. Billy's education is part of that arrangement, but it's not the primary motivation." Margaret leaned forward, her eyes bright with the intelligence that Billy had clearly inherited. "What exactly would Billy's life look like on this mountain ranch? We've heard stories about Jake Stone, that he's become strange and unpredictable since his wife died. How do we know our son would be safe in his household? I've spent an afternoon at Stone Ridge Ranch," Emma replied honestly, "and I can tell you that Mr. Stone is neither strange nor unpredictable. He's grieving and isolated, certainly, but he's also intelligent, principled, and genuinely concerned about providing proper educational opportunities for the valley's children. His housekeeper, Mrs. Martinez, has been with the family for years and speaks highly of his character." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. As for Billy's daily life, he would continue his regular studies while also learning practical skills that could serve him well regardless of what path he chooses as an adult. Ranch work teaches responsibility, problem solving, and the value of consistent effort in ways that pure book learning cannot provide. Henry and Margaret exchanged glances, communicating through the subtle language of couples who had weathered many difficulties together. Finally, Henry spoke again. "Miss Hartwell, if you truly believe this opportunity is legitimate and beneficial for Billy, we're willing to consider it. But we want to visit this ranch ourselves, meet this Jake Stone face to face, and see the conditions where our son would be living and learning. I think that's entirely reasonable." Emma agreed. "In fact, I believe Mr. Stone would welcome the opportunity to meet Billy's parents and address any concerns you might have directly. A decision of this magnitude shouldn't be made without complete information." The meeting with Grace Murphy's widowed mother proved more emotionally challenging. Patricia Murphy had been struggling to support herself and her 6-year-old daughter through sewing and occasional cooking for bachelor minors, work that barely provided enough income for basic necessities. The loss of Grace's education represented not just immediate disappointment, but the destruction of Patricia's hopes for her daughter's future advancement. "Miss Hartwell," Patricia said, tears threatening despite her obvious efforts to maintain composure, "Grace is so bright, so eager to learn. When the school closes, I don't know how I'll ever give her the opportunities she deserves. But sending her away to live with strangers, even respectable strangers, it feels like admitting I've failed as a mother." Emma's heart ached for the young widow's pain, recognizing the impossible choices that poverty forced upon loving parents. "Mrs. Murphy, considering this opportunity doesn't mean you've failed. It means you're willing to put Grace's welfare above your own feelings. which is exactly what good mothers do when circumstances require difficult decisions. She leaned forward, speaking with the conviction that came from her own experience with loss and adaptation. I've watched Grace in the classroom for months now. She has exceptional potential, not just in traditional academic subjects, but in understanding how things work, how to solve problems, how to lead other children through example. Those gifts will be wasted if her education ends now. But they could flourish in an environment that provides both intellectual challenge and practical application. Patricia wiped her eyes with a handkerchief that had been mended several times, her voice trembling as she spoke. Would I be able to see her? Would she be allowed to visit home regularly, or would this arrangement mean losing her entirely? Stone Ridge Ranch is 20 miles from town, not 20,000, Emma replied gently. Mr. Stone has made no suggestions about limiting Grace's contact with you. In fact, I believe he would encourage regular visits and communication. The goal is to provide educational opportunities, not to separate families unnecessarily. The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical details about living arrangements, educational curricula, and the specific skills Grace might learn through ranch life. By the end of the meeting, Patricia Murphy had agreed to visit Stone Ridge Ranch the following week, though her pain at the possibility of separation remained evident. The most surprising meeting was with David and Eleanor Wright, Thomas's parents. David worked as a clerk for Aldrich Pemberton's business interests, and had initially seemed likely to support keeping Thomas in traditional schooling. Instead, he and Eleanor had already discussed the possibility of accepting Emma's offer before she had even arrived at their modest but well-appointed home. Miss Hartwell, David began without preamble, Eleanor and I have been watching the changes in this town since the mining company began reducing operations. We can see the writing on the wall. Cedar Falls is going to become a much smaller, much poorer community over the next few years. Thomas needs opportunities that simply won't exist here anymore. Eleanor nodded agreement, her hands busy with needlework as she spoke. We've also heard things about Aldrich Pemberton's plans for the remaining families. Things that suggest he views the school closure as the first step in consolidating his control over the town's future. Sending Thomas to Stone Ridge Ranch might protect him from becoming entangled in whatever Pemberton has planned. This was the first Emma had heard of any broader political implications to the school's closure, and she found herself suddenly curious about dynamics in Cedar Falls that she might not have fully understood. What kind of plans are you referring to, Mrs. Wright? David and Eleanor exchanged glances before David responded carefully. Pemberton has been buying up properties as families leave town, always at prices well below their actual value. He's also been pressuring remaining businesses to accept exclusive arrangements with his companies. Some people think he's trying to turn Cedar Falls into a company town where he controls everything from employment to housing to supplies. And you think the school closure is part of this strategy? Emma asked, beginning to see potential complications she hadn't anticipated. We think eliminating educational opportunities makes it harder for families to stay, and easier for Pemberton to claim that the community can't support independent businesses or self-governance. Eleanor replied, if most of the children are sent away for schooling, their parents become more likely to follow them or to accept whatever arrangements Pemberton offers for their remaining assets. Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. If the Wrights were correct, then her partnership with Jake Stone might represent more than just educational and economic opportunity. It might also provide a form of resistance to forces that sought to eliminate choices for the valley's families. Mr. and Mrs. Wright, she said slowly, if Thomas does come to Stone Ridge Ranch, would you be interested in visiting regularly? Perhaps even relocating there yourselves if circumstances permitted. It sounds like you might benefit from alternatives to remaining in Cedar Falls under Mr. Pemberton's increasing influence. David's eyes lit up with interest he couldn't quite conceal. Are you suggesting that this arrangement might expand beyond just the children's education? I'm suggesting that Mr. Stone's vision for his ranch includes creating opportunities for people who share his values of independence, Hard work and mutual support, Emma replied carefully. If you're interested in exploring possibilities, I believe he would welcome the conversation. The meeting concluded with the Wrights' enthusiastic agreement to visit Stone Ridge Ranch and discuss not just Thomas's education but potential roles for themselves in Jake's expanding operation. Emma left their home with her head spinning from the implications of what she'd learned about Pemberton's activities and what it might mean for her new partnership. The wagon ride back to Stone Ridge Ranch gave Emma time to process the day's conversations and prepare for the discussion she needed to have with Jake about the political dimensions of their arrangement. Mac drove in companionable silence, clearly sensing that she needed time to think, while the familiar rhythm of the horse's hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels provided a soothing counterpoint to her churning thoughts. By the time they reached the ranch, Emma had decided that complete honesty about what she'd learned was the only appropriate approach. Jake deserved to know that accepting the 3 children might involve his ranch in conflicts with Aldrich Pemberton's plans for dominating Cedar Falls. She also needed to understand whether Jake was prepared for such complications, or whether they might change his willingness to proceed with their partnership. Rosa met them at the door with hot coffee and the news that Jake was in the barn attending to a mare with a difficult pregnancy. Emma found him there, working alongside one of his ranch hands to ensure the safety of both mother and foal. His sleeves were rolled up despite the cold, and his attention was completely focused on the laboring animal with the kind of patient, gentle competence that spoke to years of experience with such situations. "How is she doing?" Emma asked quietly, not wanting to disturb the process but curious about the outcome. "She'll be fine," Jake replied without looking away from the mare. "First-time mothers often have more difficulty, but she's strong and healthy. The foal should arrive within the hour." He glanced up at Emma, noting something in her expression that suggested more than casual interest in his veterinary activities. "How did the meetings with the parents go?" "They went well overall," Emma said carefully, "but I learned some things about the situation in Cedar Falls that I think you should know before we proceed further." Jake's attention sharpened immediately, though he continued his gentle ministrations to the mare. "What kind of things?" Emma summarized her conversations with the 3 families, paying particular attention to David and Eleanor Wright's observations about Aldrich Pemberton's activities and apparent long-term strategy for controlling the town. As she spoke, she watched Jake's expression grow increasingly serious, though not surprised. "I've suspected something like this was developing," Jake said when she finished. "Pemberton has approached me twice in the past year about selling portions of my property. Offers that were presented as friendly business proposals, but felt more like attempts to determine my vulnerabilities or willingness to be influenced." He straightened up, wiping his hands on a cloth as he considered the implications of what Emma had reported. "The question is whether Pemberton will view our school and our partnership as merely irrelevant to his plans, or as actual obstacles that need to be addressed." "What do you think?" Emma asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I think a successful independent school that serves multiple Valley families represents exactly the kind of community institution that would interfere with his strategy of making everyone dependent on his approval and resources," Jake replied grimly. "And I think a ranch that prospers without his involvement or support demonstrates that alternatives to his vision are not only possible but preferable." Emma felt her stomach tighten as she realized the full scope of what they might be undertaking. "Are you saying we could find ourselves in direct conflict with the most powerful man in the region simply by succeeding at what we've planned?" "I'm saying that success often creates its own enemies, especially when that success challenges assumptions about who should control resources and opportunities," Jake said with the calm acceptance of someone who had faced difficult challenges before. "The question is whether you're prepared for that possibility, because once we commit to this partnership publicly, withdrawal becomes much more complicated." Emma looked around the barn, taking in the evidence of Jake's competence and commitment to his animals, his land, and his responsibilities. She thought about Billy's eagerness to learn, Grace's bright curiosity, Thomas's serious determination to understand how things worked. She considered the alternative of watching their potential wither away in a dying town controlled by someone who valued compliance over growth and dependence over independence. Mr. Stone, she said with growing conviction, I became a teacher because I believe education can transform lives and communities. If providing that education means standing up to people who prefer ignorance because it's easier to control, then I consider that part of my professional responsibility. Jake smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression she'd seen from him since her return from town. Miss Hartwell, I believe we're going to work together very well indeed. As if responding to their renewed commitment, the mayor gave a final push and delivered a healthy fold that immediately began the wobbly process of finding its legs. Emma watched the newborn's determined efforts with something approaching awe, seeing in the tiny creature's struggle a reflection of what she and Jake were attempting to achieve through their partnership. What will you name him? She asked, noting the foal's obvious masculinity as he achieved his first successful standing position. I was thinking Pioneer, Jake replied, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of successful midwifery and renewed hope for the future. It seems appropriate for a foal born on the day we decided to build something entirely new together. Emma laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months despite the serious challenges they'd discussed. Pioneer it is, and may he grow up to be as strong and determined as his circumstances require. As they walked back toward the house, Emma found herself thinking not about the obstacles they might face, but about the opportunities they were creating. 3 children would have educational prospects they'd lost when the school closed. Jake would have the partnership and renewed purpose he'd been seeking since Catherine's death. She would have the chance to build something lasting rather than simply maintaining something that was failing. The evening air was crisp and clear, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky above the mountain peaks. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and complications, but tonight, Emma felt the deep satisfaction of having made a choice that honored both her principles and her practical needs. Whatever Aldrich Pemberton might have planned for Cedar Falls, Stone Ridge Ranch would offer an alternative vision of what mountain communities could accomplish when people chose cooperation over control. Thank you, she said to Jake as they reached the house, though she wasn't entirely sure how to articulate everything she was grateful for. Thank you, he replied, with equal sincerity, and somehow Emma knew he understood exactly what she meant. The town hall meeting that would determine Cedar Falls' future took place on a bitter February evening when the wind howled down from the peaks with enough force to rattle windows and test the resolve of anyone brave enough to venture outside. Emma had spent the day helping Jake prepare for what they both knew would be more than a simple discussion about educational policy. Aldrich Pemberton had called the meeting ostensibly to address the school closure, but the carefully worded notices posted around town suggested broader agenda items that could reshape the entire community. Emma wore her finest dress, a deep blue wool garment that had belonged to her mother and carried both dignity and defiance in its elegant simplicity. Jake had donned his best suit, the same formal attire he'd worn to Catherine's funeral, though tonight it served to project authority rather than mourn loss. Together they represented not just their individual interests, but an alternative vision for what mountain communities could accomplish when guided by principles of mutual support rather than concentrated control. The hall was packed beyond its intended capacity, with families standing along the walls and crowding near the doorway despite the cold air that entered each time someone arrived. Emma recognized most of the faces from her months of teaching in Cedar Falls, but she also saw strangers, well-dressed men who carried themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to having their opinions matter more than local concerns. These had to be Pemberton's associates from Denver and Colorado Springs, brought in to lend weight to whatever proposals he intended to present. Aldrich Pemberton himself commanded the front of the room from behind a makeshift podium, his expensive clothing and carefully groomed appearance marking him as someone who had prospered while his neighbors struggled. He was a man in his 50s, with silver hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they observed. When he spoke, his voice carried the practiced authority of someone who expected to be obeyed without question. "Friends and neighbors," Pemberton began, though his tone suggested he viewed the assembled crowd as neither. "We gather tonight to address the unfortunate reality that Cedar Falls can no longer support the institutions we once took for granted. The school closure is merely the first of several necessary adjustments to ensure our community's survival in changing economic times." Emma felt Jake tense beside her as Pemberton continued his opening remarks, each word carefully chosen to present inevitable decline as responsible planning. The banker's strategy was becoming clear, convince the remaining families that their choices were limited to accepting his guidance or facing complete destitution. "The mining company's reduction in operations has fundamentally altered our economic foundation," Pemberton explained, gesturing to charts and graphs that had been prepared by his associates. "Without the steady employment and reliable income that mining provided, we must restructure our community to reflect current realities rather than past expectations." Henry Lawson raised his hand from the middle of the crowd, his voice carrying the frustration of a man who had watched his livelihood disappear through no fault of his own. "Mr. Pemberton, what specific restructuring are you proposing? And how do these changes address the immediate needs of families who still call Cedar Falls home?" Pemberton's smile was condescending in its patience, the expression of someone explaining simple concepts to children who couldn't be expected to understand complex realities. "Mr. Lawson, I'm proposing a comprehensive development plan that would transform Cedar Falls into a coordinated business district under unified management. This approach would eliminate inefficiencies, reduce redundant services, and ensure that every family has guaranteed employment and housing appropriate to their skills and circumstances." The careful language couldn't disguise what Pemberton was actually describing. A company town where he controlled every aspect of economic and social life. Emma saw understanding dawn on faces throughout the crowd, as people realized that their banker was proposing to become their landlord, employer, and decision-maker in all matters that affected their daily existence. "What about our property rights?" demanded Patricia Murphy, her voice sharp with the anger of someone who had already lost too much to accept further surrender without resistance. "Are you suggesting we sell our homes and businesses to your company, or are you planning to simply take control regardless of our preferences?" "Mrs. Murphy, I'm suggesting that individual property ownership has become an unsustainable luxury in our current economic environment," Pemberton replied smoothly. "My associates and I are prepared to offer fair compensation for properties that fit into our development plan, while providing long-term security through employment and housing arrangements that individual families could never achieve independently." The euphemisms were transparent now, and the crowd's mood shifted perceptibly as people realized they were being offered a choice between selling to Pemberton voluntarily or finding themselves economically forced to accept his terms eventually. Emma had heard enough to understand that Jake's earlier assessment had been accurate. Their school and their partnership represented exactly the kind of independent alternative that threatened Pemberton's strategy. Jake stood slowly, his height and bearing immediately commanding attention throughout the packed hall. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had led men in circumstances where leadership failures meant death rather than mere inconvenience. "Mr. Pemberton," Jake said with deliberate formality, "your presentation assumes that Cedar Falls families have no alternatives to either economic collapse or surrender of their independence. I'd like to suggest that assumption may be incorrect." Pemberton's expression sharpened with interest that seemed more predatory than curious. "Mr. Stone, I'm certainly interested in hearing about alternatives you might propose. Your perspective as our largest independent landowner would be valuable in this discussion." Emma recognized the trap immediately. By acknowledging Jake's status as the largest landowner, Pemberton was simultaneously flattering his importance and marking him as the primary obstacle to complete consolidation of the valley's resources. Whatever Jake said next would determine whether Stone Ridge Ranch became a refuge for independent families or a target for elimination. The alternative I'm proposing is partnership rather than dependence, Jake replied, his words carrying clearly to every corner of the crowded hall. Miss Emma Hartwell and I have established an educational and agricultural cooperative that will provide schooling for Valley children while expanding ranch operations to support multiple families through honest work and shared prosperity. The murmur that ran through the crowd reflected surprise, hope, and skepticism in roughly equal measures. Emma had expected Jake to mention their partnership eventually, but his decision to present it as a direct alternative to Pemberton's consolidation plan elevated their private arrangement into a public statement of resistance. Pemberton's reaction was swift and calculated, designed to undermine Jake's credibility before the partnership could gain support. Mr. Stone, I'm sure your intentions are admirable, but I think we should consider the practical implications of what you're proposing. You're asking families to entrust their children's education and their economic futures to an arrangement based on friendship with a woman you've known for less than a week. The personal attack on Emma stung, but she recognized it as evidence that Pemberton viewed their partnership as a genuine threat to his plans. Before Jake could respond, she stood and addressed the assembly directly, her teacher's training serving her well in projecting confidence and authority despite her racing heartbeat. Mr. Pemberton raises a fair question about the foundation of our partnership, Emma said clearly, her voice carrying the conviction that came from absolute certainty in her position. I'd like to address it by explaining exactly what Mr. Stone and I are offering, and why it represents a better choice than surrendering your independence to his development scheme. She paused, gathering her thoughts and meeting the eyes of parents whose children she had taught, people she had come to know and respect during her months in Cedar Falls. I came to this community as a teacher because I believe education can transform lives and create opportunities that wouldn't otherwise exist. Mr. Stone invited me to partner with him because he recognizes that his ranch could support not just his family but multiple families, if managed with the kind of systematic planning that education provides. Emma's confidence grew as she spoke, fueled by the knowledge that she was defending not just her partnership with Jake, but the principle that people should have choices about their futures. Our school will serve any family in the valley who wants their children to receive genuine education rather than training for predetermined roles in someone else's business empire. Our ranch operations will provide employment based on skill and effort rather than compliance with arbitrary policies. The distinction she was drawing between education and training resonated powerfully with parents who understood the difference between preparing children for independent thinking and conditioning them for obedient service. Emma could see recognition dawning on faces throughout the crowd as people realized what was actually being offered by each alternative. David Wright stood from his position near the back of the hall, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood financial manipulation through his work as Pemberton's clerk. Miss Hartwell, could you be more specific about the practical arrangements your partnership would offer? Mr. Pemberton has presented detailed plans and guarantees. What comparable assurances can you and Mr. Stone provide? It was a fair question that demanded a substantive answer, and Emma was grateful that Jake had anticipated the need for specific commitments rather than general promises. Mr. Wright, we're prepared to offer immediate educational opportunities for all Valley children, regardless of their family. We're also prepared to provide employment opportunities for adults who want to participate in expanding ranch operations through shared investment of labor rather than surrender of property rights. She turned to address the entire assembly, her voice growing stronger with each word. But more than that, we're prepared to demonstrate that mountain communities can prosper through cooperation rather than consolidation, through shared effort rather than centralized control. The choice isn't between poverty and dependence. It's between building something together or surrendering everything to someone else's vision of what you should become. Pemberton had listened to this exchange with growing irritation, and now he struck back with the calculated precision of someone who had researched his opponent's vulnerabilities. Miss Hartwell's rhetoric is inspiring, but rhetoric doesn't address practical realities. Mr. Stone's ranch, however successful, cannot possibly support the number of families that would need employment if my development plan is rejected. And Miss Hartwell's educational credentials, however impressive, don't qualify her to make economic projections or guarantee employment opportunities. The attack was designed to separate Emma and Jake by questioning her qualifications while acknowledging his resources. But Pemberton had miscalculated the depth of their partnership. Jake's response was immediate and decisive, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had faced much more dangerous enemies than small-town bankers. Pemberton, you're correct that Miss Hartwell's educational background doesn't qualify her to guarantee employment for every family in the valley. Jake said with apparent reasonableness. But your banking experience doesn't qualify you to determine how these families should live their lives or raise their children. The difference is that we're offering people choices while you're demanding surrender. He paused, allowing the distinction to register with the assembled crowd before continuing with increased intensity. You've presented your development plan as inevitable, but inevitability is what people accept when they believe they have no alternatives. We're here to prove that alternatives exist for families with the courage to choose independence over security and partnership over isolation. The philosophical divide was now clear to everyone in the hall, and Emma could see people beginning to align themselves based on their fundamental beliefs about autonomy, community, and the proper relationship between economic power and personal freedom. What had begun as a discussion about school closure had evolved into a referendum on two completely different visions of what Cedar Falls could become. Margaret Lawson stood, her voice trembling with emotion but carrying the strength of maternal determination. Mr. Stone, Miss Hartwell, if we choose your partnership, what guarantee do we have that Mr. Pemberton won't simply use his financial influence to destroy what you're trying to build? He controls the bank, owns half the businesses in town, and has connections throughout the territory. How do you protect families who choose independence when dependence is enforced through economic pressure? It was the crucial question that would determine whether their partnership could attract enough support to survive. And Emma realized that Jake's answer would reveal whether he truly understood the scope of what they were undertaking. His response exceeded her expectations and demonstrated why he had succeeded as both a military officer and a ranch owner despite the challenges he'd faced. Mrs. Lawson, protection comes from strength, and strength comes from unity of purpose among people who share common values. Jake replied with the confidence of someone who had led others through genuine dangers. Mr. Pemberton's power depends on keeping families isolated and dependent on his individual approval. Our partnership demonstrates that cooperation can create alternatives to dependence, and success breeds its own protection through demonstration that independence is not only possible but preferable. He gestured toward Emma, acknowledging her as an equal partner in everything he was describing. Miss Hartwell and I aren't asking you to trust us blindly or surrender your judgment to our guidance. We're asking you to join us in proving that mountain communities can prosper through shared effort, mutual support, and commitment to principles that value human dignity over economic efficiency. The debate continued for another hour, with questions and challenges that tested every aspect of the partnership Emma and Jake were proposing. Pemberton's associates presented financial analyses designed to prove that independent ranching couldn't compete with coordinated development, while parents demanded specific details about educational curricula, employment opportunities, and living arrangements for families who chose Stone Ridge Ranch over Cedar Falls restructuring. Through it all, Emma found herself gaining confidence not just in their partnership, but in her own capabilities as an advocate for principles she had always believed, but never been forced to defend publicly. Teaching children had prepared her to explain complex concepts in understandable terms, but tonight she discovered that the same skills applied to helping adults envision possibilities they had never considered. When the formal meeting finally concluded, the crowd dispersed into smaller groups that continued discussions begun in the public forum. Emma noticed with satisfaction that more families were gathering around Jake to ask detailed questions about ranch opportunities than were clustering around Pemberton to discuss his development plans. The balance of interest suggested that their alternative vision had genuine appeal beyond simple resistance to unwanted change. Henry and Margaret Lawson approached Emma directly, their faces reflecting the careful consideration of parents who understood the magnitude of the decision they were contemplating. Miss Hartwell, Henry said quietly, Margaret and I have talked extensively about Billy's future and our own circumstances. We'd like to visit Stone Ridge Ranch this weekend to see firsthand what you and Mr. Stone are offering. We'd be delighted to have you visit, Emma replied warmly. I think seeing the actual facilities and meeting Mrs. Martinez will help you understand exactly what daily life would involve for your family. Similar conversations were taking place throughout the hall as the partnership Emma and Jake had announced attracted serious interest from families who had been dreading their limited alternatives under Pemberton's development scheme. By the time the last families departed into the cold mountain night, Emma estimated that at least 6 households had committed to visiting Stone Ridge Ranch within the next 2 weeks. Jake helped Emma into the wagon for the ride home, his expression reflecting satisfaction tempered by awareness that tonight's success was only the beginning of much larger challenges. You handled yourself exceptionally well in there, he said, as Mac guided the horses through the darkness toward their mountain sanctuary. Pemberton didn't expect to face someone who could match his rhetorical skills while offering substantive alternatives to his proposals. Thank you, Emma replied, though she was already thinking ahead to the practical implications of what they had committed to during the evening's discussions. Now we need to prove that everything we promised tonight can actually be delivered. How quickly can we convert Catherine's music room into a proper schoolhouse? Rosa and I can have it ready within 2 weeks if we focus all our efforts on that project, Jake said confidently. The structural work is minimal, mainly installing proper desks, bookshelves, and a larger heating stove. The real challenge will be obtaining adequate textbooks and supplies for students at different educational levels. Emma smiled, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from tackling problems that had solutions rather than simply enduring difficulties that had to be accepted. Leave the educational materials to me. I know suppliers in Denver who can provide everything we need. And I have enough savings remaining to cover initial costs until we can establish sustainable funding through ranch operations. As Stone Ridge Ranch appeared in the distance, its windows glowing warmly against the cold mountain darkness, Emma realized that she was no longer thinking about their partnership as an experiment or temporary arrangement. Tonight's public commitment had transformed their private agreement into something much larger and more permanent. A foundation for the kind of community she had always hoped to help create. Jake, she said as they reached the house, using his first name for the first time since their partnership began. I want you to know that whatever challenges we face going forward, I'm completely committed to making this work. Not just for the children or for our individual benefit, but because what we're building here represents something important about human dignity and the right to choose one's own path. Jake helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering on hers for just a moment longer than strictly necessary. Emma, he replied, her name sounding natural and right in his deep voice. I believe we're going to create something extraordinary together, something worthy of the trust these families are placing in us, and something that honors the best of what mountain communities can accomplish. As they walked toward the house where Rosa waited with hot coffee and the warmth of genuine welcome, Emma felt a profound sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with familiar surroundings and everything to do with finding her proper place in the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they worked to transform promises into realities. But tonight she was exactly where she belonged, building something meaningful with someone who shared her deepest values about education, community, and the courage required to choose independence over security. The mountain wind that had seemed so hostile earlier in the evening now felt like a promise of the strength and endurance that would be required for the work ahead. Emma Hartwell had found her calling, her partner, and her home in the most unexpected circumstances, proving once again that the best opportunities often emerged from the deepest challenges when faced with courage, principle, and the willingness to work together toward shared goals. 6 months later, Stone Ridge Ranch had become the thriving heart of a mountain community that bore no resemblance to Aldrich Pemberton's vision of coordinated dependence. The schoolhouse that had once been Catherine's music room now housed 12 students, whose laughter and eager questions filled the mountain air with the sounds of genuine learning. 8 families had chosen partnership over surrender, creating a cooperative network that supported both individual achievement and mutual prosperity. Emma stood in the doorway of their school on a bright August morning, watching her students tend the vegetable garden that had become an integral part of their practical education curriculum. Billy Lawson was teaching the younger children how to identify ripe tomatoes, while Thomas Wright explained crop rotation principles with the authority of someone who had mastered both the theory and practice of sustainable agriculture. Grace Murphy was helping her classmates understand the mathematical concepts involved in calculating harvest yields, her natural leadership abilities flourishing in an environment that encouraged both academic excellence and practical application. The ranch itself had prospered beyond Jake's most optimistic projections, with expanded cattle operations, diversified crop production, and a small dairy that supplied not just their own community, but customers in 3 neighboring valleys. The success had attracted attention from families throughout the territory, who were seeking alternatives to the economic uncertainties and social restrictions that characterized more conventional communities. Most significantly, the partnership between Emma and Jake had evolved from professional cooperation into something deeper and more personal. Though always built on the foundation of mutual respect and shared values that had brought them together originally. They had married in a simple ceremony performed by Reverend Brooks, with their students serving as witnesses and their extended ranch family providing celebration that lasted well into the mountain evening. As Emma watched her husband working with the older boys to repair fence sections damaged by the previous winter's storms, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from the desperate teacher hiding her fears in a failing school to the confident educator and ranch partner who had helped create something unprecedented in mountain community development. The empty classroom that had once symbolized defeat had been replaced by a thriving educational center that proved the power of vision combined with determination and mutual support. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the main road, where a familiar wagon was making its way up the mountain path. Sheriff Frank Garrison made regular visits to Stone Ridge Ranch, partly for official reasons but mostly because he had become a strong supporter of what they had accomplished and wanted to stay informed about their continued success. Emma, the sheriff called as he climbed down from his wagon. "I've got news from town that I thought you and Jake should hear directly from me." Emma felt a flutter of concern, though Sheriff Garrison's expression suggested good news rather than problems. "What kind of news, Frank?" "Aldrich Pemberton's development company has filed for bankruptcy," the sheriff announced with obvious satisfaction. "Turns out his plans depended on acquiring much more property than he was able to purchase. And when families started choosing your partnership instead of his offers, the whole scheme collapsed financially." The news was surprising but not entirely unexpected. Emma had heard through various sources that Pemberton's grand plans had stalled as more families chose independence over his version of security. But she hadn't realized how completely his strategy had been undermined by their success. "What happens to the families who did accept his arrangements?" Emma asked, her teacher's instinct making her concerned about anyone who might be harmed by Pemberton's failure. "Most of them are going to be fine," Sheriff Garrison replied reassuringly. "The territorial government is stepping in to ensure that property rights are protected and employment contracts are honored. But more importantly, several of those families have been asking about opportunities here at Stone Ridge Ranch." Emma smiled, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from seeing principles vindicated through practical results. Their partnership with Jake had succeeded not just in providing alternatives for their own families, but in demonstrating that cooperation and mutual support could create sustainable prosperity that didn't depend on surrendering freedom to economic authorities. As the sheriff departed, and Emma returned to watching her students work in their garden, she reflected on the profound truth that sometimes the greatest victories emerged from what initially appeared to be the most devastating defeats. The school closure that had threatened to end her career had instead led her to discover her true calling as an educator who could combine academic excellence with practical wisdom, individual achievement with community cooperation. The mountain man who had promised to work his land while working to deserve her had kept both parts of that commitment completely, creating not just economic prosperity, but the kind of partnership that honored both individual dignity and shared responsibility. Together, they had proved that the right people in the right circumstances could indeed build something extraordinary, something worthy of the trust placed in them by families brave enough to choose hope over fear, independence over dependence, and the challenging path of cooperation over the easier route of surrender. 2 years after the partnership that changed everything, Emma Stone stood on the porch of the expanded ranch house, watching her husband Jake, teach their newest arrivals how to properly handle the highland cattle that had become Stone Ridge Ranch's specialty. The Pemberton crisis seemed like ancient history now, overshadowed by accomplishments that had exceeded even their most ambitious original plans. The ranch now supported 14 families in various capacities, from full partners who shared in the profits to skilled workers who earned wages that allowed them to purchase their own land in the valley. The school had grown to accommodate 23 students ranging from 6 to 16 years old, with a curriculum that seamlessly blended traditional academics with practical skills that prepared young people for leadership roles in the emerging mountain communities throughout the territory. Emma's own role had evolved far beyond her original position as Jake's partner in ranch management. She had become the unofficial coordinator for a network of independent communities that stretched across 3 valleys, helping other groups establish their own educational and agricultural cooperatives using the model she and Jake had developed at Stone Ridge. Her reputation as an educator who could combine theoretical knowledge with practical application had attracted attention from as far away as California, where established communities were seeking to reform their own approaches to education and economic development. The transformation was perhaps most visible in the children who had been Emma's original students in Cedar Falls. Billy Lawson, now 10 years old, had become the ranch's unofficial veterinary assistant, displaying an intuitive understanding of animal health that impressed even the professional livestock dealers who visited Stone Ridge regularly. His parents, Henry and Margaret, had discovered talents they never knew they possessed, with Henry emerging as a gifted carpenter and Margaret developing into the valley's most skilled midwife and herbalist. Thomas Wright had grown into a natural leader who combined his academic abilities with an understanding of agricultural science that suggested a future as either an agricultural innovator or perhaps a territorial legislator. His parents had established their own small ranch on land purchased from Jake at generous terms, proving that the cooperative model could spawn successful independent ventures that strengthened rather than competed with the original partnership. Grace Murphy had blossomed into a confident young lady, whose artistic talents had found expression in everything from architectural drawings for new buildings to detailed botanical illustrations that accompanied the medicinal herb guides her adoptive grandmother Rosa Martinez was compiling. Her mother Patricia had remarried one of the ranch's most skilled workers and was expecting her second child, a development that filled Emma's heart with particular satisfaction. The success stories extended beyond the original families to include newcomers who had arrived seeking the opportunities that Stone Ridge Ranch had become famous for throughout the territory. The Henderson family had fled economic collapse in Kansas and found not just employment but genuine community among people who valued hard work and mutual support. The Chen family had left California's goldfields when discrimination made advancement impossible, discovering at Stone Ridge the first place where their children could receive education while their parents' skills were appreciated rather than merely tolerated. Dr. Henry Caldwell had relocated his practice from Cedar Falls to Stone Ridge when it became clear that the ranch community needed medical services that reflected their values of preventive care and holistic treatment. His partnership with Rosa Martinez had created a medical approach that combined modern scientific knowledge with traditional herbal remedies, resulting in health outcomes that surpassed anything available in larger towns throughout the region. The educational innovations Emma had pioneered were attracting national attention from reformers who recognized that traditional schooling was failing to prepare children for the realities of American expansion and development. Her integration of academic learning with practical skills, individual achievement with community responsibility, and intellectual development with character formation had created graduates who were sought after by employers and communities throughout the West. Jake's transformation had been equally dramatic, though perhaps less visible to casual observers. The grieving widower who had retreated into solitude after Catherine's death had evolved into a community leader whose vision extended far beyond the boundaries of his own property. His expertise in sustainable agriculture and cooperative business models had made him a consultant to territorial officials who were struggling to address the social and economic disruptions caused by rapid industrialization and population movement.
More personally, Jake had discovered that his capacity for love had not died with Catherine but had simply needed the right circumstances to flourish again. His marriage to Emma had begun as a practical
partnership, but had deepened into genuine romantic love built on shared values, mutual respect, and daily demonstrations of commitment to their common goals. Their relationship had become a model for other couples in their community, proving that marriages based on partnership could achieve both personal happiness and professional success. The ranch house itself reflected their expanding influence and responsibilities. What had once been a comfortable home for a small family had been enlarged to accommodate the steady stream of visitors who came to study their methods, the community meetings that had become central to regional planning, and the extended family of workers and partners who had made Stone Ridge their permanent home. Emma's study occupied the entire second floor of the house's newest wing, with walls lined with books, maps, correspondence, and the detailed records that documented every aspect of their agricultural and educational innovations. Her desk was never clear of letters from other communities seeking advice, reports from government officials studying their methods, and manuscripts for the articles she was writing for national publications about educational reform and cooperative economics. But the room Emma treasured most was the nursery that Jake had built adjoining their bedroom, anticipating the children they hoped to have together. The space remained empty for now, though Emma's recent conversations with Dr. Caldwell suggested that might change before the year was over. The possibility of raising their own children in the community they had created together filled both Emma and Jake with anticipation that added new dimensions to their already rich partnership. The community they had built faced its own evolving challenges as success brought increased attention from government officials, business interests, and social reformers who wanted either to regulate, exploit, or replicate what Stone Ridge Ranch had accomplished. Emma had learned to navigate these pressures with the same combination of principled determination and practical flexibility that had made their original partnership successful. The territorial legislature had proposed incorporating Stone Ridge and the surrounding communities into a formal township with standardized governance and taxation structures that would align them more closely with conventional municipal models. Emma and Jake had successfully argued that their cooperative arrangements were producing better outcomes than traditional local government while maintaining individual freedom and property rights that centralized administration would necessarily compromise. Business interests from Denver and San Francisco had made increasingly aggressive offers to purchase either the ranch's operations or the rights to franchise their educational and agricultural methods in other locations. These proposals reflected recognition that Stone Ridge Ranch had developed valuable intellectual property, but Emma and Jake had consistently refused arrangements that would compromise their community's autonomy or dilute their methods through commercial exploitation. The most persistent pressure came from educational reformers who wanted to systematize and scale the teaching innovations Emma had developed at Stone Ridge. While she was grateful for professional recognition and eager to share effective methods with other educators, she resisted efforts to reduce her integrated approach to standardized curricula that could be implemented without the community partnerships that made holistic education possible. On this particular autumn morning, Emma was preparing for a visit from a delegation of territorial officials who were conducting a comprehensive study of alternative community models for potential inclusion in statehood planning discussions. The territory of Colorado was moving toward formal admission to the Union, and Stone Ridge Ranch had been identified as an example of successful community development that might inform policies for the new state's rural areas. Jake emerged from the barn, where he had been working with the morning's visitors, his face showing the satisfaction that always accompanied successful instruction in agricultural techniques. "The delegation from Kansas is heading back to their wagon," he reported. "They're convinced that our Highland cattle breeding program could work in their climate, and they want to purchase breeding stock as soon as we can arrange transport." "That's wonderful news," Emma replied, though her mind was already focused on the afternoon's more challenging visitors. "Are you ready for the territorial officials? I suspect their questions will be more complicated than anything we've faced from agricultural delegates." Jake's expression grew more serious as he considered the political implications of the upcoming meeting. "I'm ready to defend what we've accomplished and explain why it works," he said carefully. "But I'm also prepared for the possibility that statehood politics might require compromises we're not willing to make." The territorial delegation arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, led by Commissioner James Morrison, a former military officer who had been appointed to study community governance models throughout Colorado Territory. His companions included a lawyer specializing in land use policy, an educator from the Territorial Department of Public Instruction, and a clerk whose job was apparently to document everything discussed during their visit. Emma and Jake received their visitors in the main room of the ranch house, with Rosa serving coffee and the kind of elaborate refreshments that demonstrated both hospitality and the community's prosperity. The officials were clearly impressed by the house's combination of comfort and functionality, though Emma suspected they were also calculating how Stone Ridge Ranch's success might be regulated, taxed, or otherwise brought under territorial control. Mr. and Mrs. Stone, Commissioner Morrison began formally. We appreciate your willingness to discuss Stone Ridge Ranch's operations and governance structures. Our preliminary research suggests that your community has achieved remarkable success in areas where traditional approaches have often failed. We're here to understand how you've accomplished this and whether your methods might be applicable to other communities throughout the territory. Emma recognized both the compliment and the implicit threat in the commissioner's words. Territorial officials were interested in Stone Ridge Ranch's success, but they were also concerned about communities that operated outside conventional governmental and economic structures. Their study would determine whether Stone Ridge was viewed as a model to be encouraged or an anomaly to be regulated into conformity. Commissioner Morrison, Emma replied diplomatically, we're happy to explain our methods and share our experiences with anyone who might benefit from what we've learned. Our success has been built on principles that we believe could indeed benefit other communities, though the specific applications would necessarily vary based on local conditions and community values. The commissioner's questions covered every aspect of Stone Ridge Ranch's operations, from the legal structures that govern property ownership and profit sharing to the educational methods that had produced such remarkable results with students from diverse backgrounds. Emma and Jake answered honestly and thoroughly, though they were careful to emphasize that their success depended on voluntary proactivity. Mrs. Stone, the territorial educator, interjected, your educational results are impressive, but they raise questions about standardization and credential recognition. How do you ensure that students educated at Stone Ridge Ranch will be prepared for higher education or employment in more conventional settings? It was a fair question that Emma had anticipated, and her answer reflected years of careful thought about the relationship between innovative education and broader social expectations. Our students consistently outperform their peers in both academic subjects and practical skills because our approach integrates rather than separates different types of learning, she explained. When young people understand the mathematical principles involved in calculating crop yields, they master both mathematics and agriculture more thoroughly than they would through separate study of either subject. She continued with growing confidence, drawing on documented evidence of their students' achievements. Our graduates have been accepted to universities throughout the region, often with advanced standing due to their superior preparation. They've also established successful businesses, farms, and professional practices that demonstrate the practical value of integrated education. The question isn't whether our methods prepare students for the wider world, but whether the wider world is prepared for students who combine academic excellence with practical competence and strong character formation. The lawyer accompanying the delegation raised the issue that Emma had been expecting and dreading in equal measure. Stone, your community's cooperative ownership structures and profit-sharing arrangements are innovative, but they also exist outside established legal frameworks for business organization and property rights. How do you address potential conflicts between your internal arrangements and territorial or federal law? Jake's response demonstrated the careful legal research he and Emma had conducted as their community attracted official attention. Our arrangements are based on voluntary contracts between consenting adults who have chosen to pool resources and share risks in pursuit of common goals, he explained. These contracts are enforceable under existing territorial law and don't conflict with any federal statutes governing property rights or business organization. We're not claiming exemption from legal requirements, but rather demonstrating that existing law can accommodate innovative approaches when those approaches serve legitimate purposes.
The questioning continued for over 3 hours, covering topics that ranged from taxation and military service obligations to religious freedom and women's rights. Emma found herself defending not just their specific practices but the philosophical principles that guided their community's approach to balancing individual freedom with collective responsibility. As the afternoon wore on, Emma began to sense that the delegation was moving from information gathering toward evaluation and recommendation development. The commissioner's questions became more pointed, focusing on aspects of Stone Ridge Ranch that might be seen as precedents for other communities or potential challenges to territorial authority. "Mrs. Stone," Commissioner Morrison said finally, "you and your husband have created something remarkable here. Something that addresses many of the challenges facing frontier communities throughout the territory. The question we must consider is whether your success depends on unique circumstances and exceptional leadership, or whether it represents a model that could be systematically encouraged and supported through territorial policy." Emma understood that the commissioner's question would determine Stone Ridge Ranch's future relationship with territorial and eventually state government. Their answer could result in either support and encouragement for their innovations or increased regulation and pressure to conform to more conventional community models. "Commissioner Morrison," Emma replied with careful deliberation, "our success depends on principles that are universal, though their application must be adapted to local circumstances and community values. The principles are voluntary cooperation, mutual support, individual responsibility, and shared commitment to long-term prosperity rather than short-term profit. These principles can guide any community, but they cannot be imposed by outside authority or maintained without genuine commitment from community members." She paused, knowing that her next words would define how territorial officials viewed not just Stone Ridge Ranch but the entire concept of alternative community development. "What makes our community successful is not exceptional leadership or unique circumstances, but the simple recognition that people prosper when they have genuine choices about how to organize their lives and work. Government can support such choices by protecting individual rights and enforcing voluntary agreements, but it cannot create the personal commitment and mutual trust that make cooperative communities successful." Jake added his support to Emma's position with the authority that came from his practical experience in building and maintaining their community. "Commissioner Morrison, territorial policy can either encourage innovation and voluntary cooperation, or it can insist on standardization and centralized control. But it cannot achieve both simultaneously. Communities like ours demonstrate that people can solve their own problems and create their own prosperity when given the freedom and legal protection to do so." The delegation concluded their visit with promises to include Stone Ridge Ranch prominently in their final report to the territorial legislature, though they were careful not to indicate what recommendations they would make regarding policy implications. Emma and Jake saw them off with appropriate courtesy, but both knew that their community's future autonomy might depend on political decisions made by people who had never experienced the daily realities of cooperative community life. As the officials' wagons disappeared down the mountain road, Emma found herself reflecting on how much had changed since her desperate days as a failing teacher in a dying town. The scared young woman who had accepted Jake's partnership offer primarily because she had no alternatives had evolved into a confident community leader whose innovations were influencing territorial policy discussions. That evening, as Emma and Jake sat before their fireplace discussing the day's meetings and their implications for the community's future, Emma felt the profound satisfaction that came from having built something meaningful and lasting through principled effort and mutual support. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them with the same combination of individual determination and cooperative strength that had brought them this far. "Jake," Emma said as they prepared to retire for the evening, "when you made that promise to work your land while working to deserve me, did you imagine it would lead to all this?" Jake smiled, his eyes reflecting the contentment of a man who had found his proper purpose in life. "Emma, when I made that promise, I was hoping it would help me become worthy of one extraordinary woman's partnership. I never imagined it would lead to building a community that could serve as a model for territorial development policy." He paused, his expression growing more serious as he considered the broader implications of what they had accomplished together. But I think maybe that's how the best things happen. We start by trying to do right by the people we care about, and sometimes that effort creates something larger and more important than anything we originally envisioned. Emma nodded, understanding that their personal partnership had indeed grown into something with implications far beyond their original intentions. The desperate teacher and the grieving widower who had joined forces to provide educational opportunities for 3 children had created a community model that might influence how the American West developed as territories became states and frontier settlements evolved into permanent communities. As they climbed the stairs to their bedroom, Emma reflected on the profound truth that sometimes the most important changes began with the smallest acts of kindness and courage. A mountain man's promise to an unemployed teacher had grown into a demonstration that people could indeed build extraordinary things when they combined individual excellence with mutual support, personal freedom with shared responsibility, and practical wisdom with principled determination. The ranch house settled into peaceful quiet around them. But Emma knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities as their community continued to grow and influence the broader development of the American mountain regions. The promise Jake had made 2 years ago had been kept completely, but their work together was just beginning as they faced the exciting possibility of helping to shape how the American dream of independence and prosperity could be achieved through cooperation rather than competition, partnership rather than isolation, and community rather than purely individual effort. The mountain winds that had once seemed so threatening now felt like promises of the strength and endurance that would carry them through whatever lay ahead. Emma Stone had found her calling, her community, and her destiny in the most unexpected circumstances, proving once again that the courage to choose hope over fear, partnership over isolation, and principle over convenience could indeed transform not just individual lives but entire regions and perhaps even the broader story of American community development. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.